For years, my life had followed the same predictable rhythm. The house was always in order, the dinners were always prepared, and my husband, David, always came home at exactly the same time. Our marriage was stable, respectable, everything that people would call a good life. But somewhere along the way, the warmth that had once filled our home had faded into something colder, quieter. I told myself that this was normal, that love after decades together turned into something else, something steadier, less urgent. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had become invisible, a fixture in the background of my own life. David no longer looked at me the way he used to, no longer reached for me with the same hunger. And though I pretended not to notice, the absence of his touch had left an ache inside me that I couldn't shake. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. I was at the local community center, attending a charity event, something I had done 100 times before. As I moved through the room, exchanging polite conversation, my gaze landed on someone unfamiliar. He was younger, late 30s perhaps, with an easy confidence that made him stand out among the older crowd. His name was Daniel. He was a friend of one of the board members, recently moved to town, and as I was introduced to him, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in years. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Vivian, right? I've heard about you. You run half the events in this town, don't you?" I laughed, brushing off the compliment, but something in the way he looked at me, like he was really seeing me, sent a rush of warmth through me. I wasn't used to that kind of attention anymore. Throughout the evening, I found myself glancing in his direction more than I should have. And each time, he was already watching me. By the time I left that night, my hands were trembling slightly, my pulse unsteady. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a fleeting moment. But as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I knew better. For the first time in years, I felt awake. The next few days were filled with thoughts I couldn't quite control. Every quiet moment was an opportunity for my mind to return to Daniel, to the way his voice had lingered in my ears long after I left the event, to the feeling of his eyes tracing the contours of my face as if I were something worth noticing. I reminded myself that this was ridiculous. I was a married woman, living a life that I had chosen. But choice didn't erase longing, and it certainly didn't suppress desire. I caught myself checking my reflection more than usual, smoothing down my dress before heading out to run errands, applying a shade of lipstick that had long collected dust in my vanity. It wasn't for him, I told myself. It was just for me, to remind myself that I could still feel beautiful. But deep down, I knew the truth. One afternoon, as I walked through town, I saw him again. He was standing outside a cafe, deep in conversation with someone, but the moment his gaze lifted and met mine, the breath hitched in my throat. There was no mistaking the recognition in his eyes or the small, knowing smile that tugged at his lips. He excused himself from his companion and closed the distance between us with an easy grace that made my heart pound in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Vivian," he greeted, his voice warm, familiar, though we had only spoken once before. "You look lovely today." The words sent a rush of heat through me, unwarranted and entirely unwanted, but undeniable. "Thank you," I replied, willing my voice to remain steady. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Neither was I," he admitted, a hint of amusement in his tone. "But I'm glad I did." The air between us crackled with something unspoken, something dangerous. I should have ended the conversation then, made some polite excuse and walked away. But I didn't. I let myself linger, let him ask me about my day, let the warmth of his attention seep into the cracks that had formed in my heart over the years. And as I walked away, feeling his gaze follow me, I realized something terrifying. I wanted to see him again. The days that followed were filled with a restless energy I couldn't quite shake. I told myself that my encounter with Daniel was harmless, that the way he looked at me didn't mean anything, that I was reading too much into things. But the thoughts wouldn't leave me. I found myself reliving the moment outside the cafe, the easy confidence in his voice, the warmth of his smile, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. I told myself I wouldn't see him again, but part of me hoped otherwise. And when fate, or something far more dangerous, led me back to him, I didn't turn away. It happened at the grocery store, of all places. I was reaching for a bottle of wine when I heard his voice behind me. "Any recommendations?" he asked, his tone light, teasing. I turned, my breath catching for just a second. He stood close, too close, his presence radiating an effortless charm that made my pulse quicken. I forced a small smile. "Depends on what you're pairing it with." His eyes held mine for just a beat longer than necessary. Something bold, something with depth. Something unexpected. I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in my stomach. It was just a conversation, nothing more. But the way he spoke, the way his voice dipped ever so slightly, made it clear that there was something lingering beneath the surface. Something neither of us was willing to name. I told myself to be careful, to walk away. But instead, I found myself talking to him, laughing at his jokes, feeling that same thrill I had felt the first time we met. When I finally left the store, my hands trembled around the paper bag, my heart pounding with something dangerously close to anticipation. The next day, I went to the bookstore, telling myself it was for a new novel to distract me. But when I saw him there, casually leaning against a shelf, flipping through pages, I knew better. He looked up, smiled, as if he had been waiting for me. "Vivian," he greeted. "We have to stop meeting like this." I should have laughed it off, made some excuse, but I didn't. Instead, I felt the corners of my lips curve into a smile of their own accord. Yes, we really should. But neither of us made a move to leave. Something had started, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. The following days felt like a game I hadn't meant to start playing. I told myself to stay away, but the pull was stronger than reason. Every time I ran into Daniel, whether in town, at the community center, or simply by accident, I felt my body respond before my mind could warn me. A rush of heat, a racing pulse, an awareness of him that I had no control over. I began dressing with more care, smoothing the fabric of my dress, applying a shade of lipstick I hadn't worn in years. I told myself it was just a reminder that I was still a woman, still capable of feeling wanted. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted him to notice. One evening, as I stood in my kitchen preparing dinner, my phone vibrated on the counter. A message. From him. "Daniel, thinking about our accidental meetings. Funny how they keep happening." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. I should have ignored it. But I didn't. Me. Funny indeed. A pause. Then another message. "Daniel, maybe we should stop pretending they're accidents." My breath caught. This was the moment. The moment I could step back, end this before it spiraled into something I couldn't control. But my heart betrayed me, hammering in my chest as I typed a reply. Me, maybe we should. The message was sent before I could rethink it. And when my phone buzzed again, his response was simple. "Daniel, tomorrow? 5 p.m. The cafe." I stared at the screen, my pulse thrumming. I had just made a choice. One I wasn't sure I could take back. The next afternoon, I stood in front of my mirror, my hand smoothing down the fabric of my dress. It wasn't anything extravagant, just something that fit well, something that made me feel confident. I told myself I was overthinking things, that this was just coffee, just a casual meeting between two people who happened to cross paths too often to ignore. But the way my pulse fluttered beneath my skin, the way I kept glancing at the time, said otherwise. By the time I arrived at the cafe, Daniel was already there. He sat by the window, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup, his gaze flicking up the moment I walked in. A slow smile spread across his lips, one that made warmth pool low in my stomach. "Vivian," he greeted, his voice smooth, inviting. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "I almost didn't," I admitted, sliding into the seat across from him. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. "But you did." I exhaled slowly, my fingers tracing the rim of my cup as I avoided his gaze. "I did." The conversation flowed effortlessly. He was charming, attentive, his attention solely on me. It had been so long since someone looked at me like that, as if I were the most interesting person in the room. He asked about my life, my past, the things that made me happy. He listened, not out of politeness, but with genuine curiosity, as if every word I spoke mattered. Somewhere between the laughter and the shared glances, I stopped thinking about right and wrong. The boundaries I had been so determined to maintain blurred, and for the first time in years, I let myself enjoy the moment without guilt whispering in my ear. When we finally left the cafe, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the streets in a golden glow. I should have said goodbye then, should have walked back to my car and gone home. But when he reached for my hand, his fingers skimming over mine, I didn't move away. "Come with me," he murmured. I knew what he was asking. Knew that if I followed him, there would be no turning back. Every logical thought screamed for me to step away, to end this before it was too late. But as I looked into his eyes, saw the silent invitation in them, I felt something inside me unravel. I nodded. And with that single movement, I crossed the line I had sworn I wouldn't. We walked through the dimming streets, my heart pounding with every step. The world around us faded, the sounds of traffic, of distant conversations, becoming nothing more than background noise. My focus was on him, on the warmth of his hand against mine, the way his thumb traced slow, lazy circles along my skin. His apartment was just a few blocks away, a place I had never seen but now felt inevitable. When we stepped inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The door closed softly behind us, sealing us into a moment that neither of us could undo. He turned to me, his gaze searching, waiting for any sign of hesitation. But I gave him none. Instead, I reached for him first, my fingers grazing his jaw before sliding into his hair, pulling him closer. His breath hitched, and then his lips were on mine, slow at first, testing, before deepening into something far more desperate. His hands found my waist, pulling me flush against him, and I let myself melt into the heat of him. I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted like this, to be desired with an urgency that left no room for doubt. Every touch, every movement, unraveled me further, stripping away the years of restraint, the walls I had built around myself. I knew I was making a mistake. I knew that once the night was over, reality would come crashing back in. But in that moment, with his hands on my body and his voice murmuring my name against my skin, I didn't care. I had already fallen too far to stop now. The morning after should have been filled with warmth, with the lingering glow of something new and intoxicating. But as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, a dull ache settled in my chest. The night had been everything I hadn't known I was missing: his hands, his breath, the way he had made me feel like a woman again, alive and wanted. And yet, as the sunlight crept through the curtains, a cold reality began to seep in. I turned my head, expecting to find Daniel beside me, but his side of the bed was empty. My stomach twisted, a sick sense of déjà vu washing over me. I sat up slowly, pulling the sheet around me as I listened to the quiet hum of the city outside. The apartment was silent. Too silent. Slipping out of bed, I reached for my dress, my fingers shaking as I pulled it over my shoulders. My mind raced with excuses, with possible reasons for his absence. Maybe he had gone to get coffee. Maybe he wanted to let me sleep. Maybe. A voice cut through my thoughts, low and amused. Didn't expect you to still be here. I turned sharply, my heart lurching. Daniel stood in the doorway, fully dressed, leaning against the frame with an unreadable expression. Gone was the warmth from last night, the gentle hands, the whispered words. In their place was something cooler, detached. I forced a smile, ignoring the sudden tightness in my throat. I woke up alone. He shrugged, stepping into the room. Didn't want to wake you. Something in his tone felt off, but I pushed the doubt away. I was overthinking. I had to be. I should go, I murmured, reaching for my shoes. I have a lot to do today. Yeah, that's probably best. The words were casual, dismissive, and they hit harder than I wanted to admit. My fingers fumbled with the strap of my heel, and for the first time in years, I felt truly foolish. I had let myself believe this was something more. That I was something more. But as I looked at Daniel, at the way he stood there so unaffected, as if last night had been nothing but a passing thrill, I knew I had been wrong. I swallowed the lump in my throat, straightening. I'll see you around, then. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Take care, Vivian. I walked past him without another word, my chest tight, my legs unsteady. By the time I stepped onto the street, the crisp morning air hit me like a slap. I had known this would end. I had known, and yet the sting of it still burned. I had crossed the line. And now I had to live with it. The drive home was long, each mile stretching out like a cruel reminder of my mistake. My hands tightened around the wheel, my thoughts spiraling through every moment of the night before, every touch, every whispered word. It had felt so real then, so inevitable. But now, in the harsh light of day, it was clear just how much I had let myself believe in a fantasy. When I arrived home, the house was still. David was already gone for the day, his routine unchanged, his world unshaken by my betrayal. Guilt twisted in my stomach as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The space felt different now, colder, as if it somehow knew what I had done. I wandered to the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee with trembling hands. I had thought this would make me feel something, alive, wanted, desirable. But all I felt now was hollow. The days that followed blurred together, a monotonous cycle of regret and self-recrimination. I told myself I wouldn't see Daniel again, that I had learned my lesson. But late at night, when I lay in bed beside my sleeping husband, my thoughts still drifted to him, to the way his hands had felt on my skin, to the way he had made me feel like someone else, if only for a night. And that was the cruelest part of it all. Because no matter how much I tried to move past it, a part of me still longed to go back. The days turned into weeks, and still, the weight of my actions clung to me like a shadow. I moved through my life as though nothing had changed, smiling where it was expected, laughing at the right moments, going through the motions of a woman who had it all together. But inside, I was unraveling. David never suspected a thing. He still kissed my cheek each morning before leaving for work, still asked how my day had been over dinner. I had built a life with him, shared years of memories, and yet I had betrayed him in a way I could never take back. Every time he looked at me with the same quiet trust, a knot tightened in my stomach. I told myself that one night didn't define me, that I wasn't a bad person. But no matter how many times I tried to rewrite the narrative in my head, the truth always found a way to creep back in. Daniel hadn't reached out. Not once. I told myself it was for the best, that it was better to let that night fade into nothing. But some nights, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been just another conquest, just another woman he had pulled into his orbit for a brief moment before moving on. One afternoon, while running errands, I spotted him across the street. He was laughing, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a woman who was younger, vibrant, effortlessly beautiful. My stomach twisted at the sight, but I forced myself to look away. What had I expected? That he would be haunted the way I was. That he would be thinking of me the way I still thought of him. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying my reflection. The lines around my eyes looked deeper, the weight of guilt pressing against my chest like an anchor. I had wanted to feel alive again, to be seen, to be desired. But instead, I had been left with nothing but regret. I had lost myself in a fantasy, and now, I was left to pick up the pieces of the life I had nearly destroyed. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I would ever feel whole again. The following days dragged on in a haze of routine. I tried to lose myself in work, in the mundane tasks of running the household, in the normalcy of dinner conversations with David. But nothing felt normal anymore. I could barely meet his eyes without feeling like a stranger in my own home. The weight of my secret gnawed at me, growing heavier with each passing day. One evening, as I stood by the sink washing dishes, I heard David's voice behind me. "You've been quiet lately." I forced a smile, gripping the edge of the counter. "Just tired." He nodded, but the concern didn't fade from his expression. "If something's bothering you, you can talk to me." I wanted to. I wanted to collapse into his arms and confess everything, to let the truth spill out so that I wouldn't have to carry it alone anymore. But I couldn't. If I told him, it would ruin everything we had built, everything he still believed in. Instead, I turned to him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "I know," I whispered. "I'm fine." But we both knew that was a lie. That night, as I lay awake in bed beside him, I thought about the choices I had made, about the woman I had become. I had wanted something more, something beyond the quiet stability of my life. And for one reckless night, I had reached for it. But now, I understood that some desires were better left unfulfilled, that some fires burned too hot to touch without getting burned. I didn't know if I could fix what had been broken inside me. But as I watched David sleeping beside me, his breaths even and steady, I knew one thing: I would never make the same mistake again.